Hello, I'm Professor Peter Jonathan, your stylish scientist. I wanted to come back to the topic of fashion. Um, I was recently presented with an article, which I want to talk about today, about or attempting to understand individual differences in fashion. And as uh, someone interested in this area, I was very excited to read such a piece. One of the authors is someone I know reasonably well. I would maybe even go so far as to call her an academic friend. And but as we've talked about already, the ability to study this topic is quite challenging, and they admit this in this article. But what I want to bring to your attention through going through this article with you is partly the science of how they did their work, and maybe potentially the science of fashion, but how some of these um, scientific methods that are typically used are actually holding us back for our ability to understand fashion, if I'm honest. So here we go. So the article, which I'll give to you here, put my tonic water down here, come to you with my old man glasses and the article. So I have it here, and I want to do them as much justice as I can. So I'm going to go through it in my hand. So it's called "Understanding the Psychology of Fashion: Demographic, Personality, and Fashion Factors Underlying Everyday Clothing Choices in the United Kingdom and the United States." This is published in the AP journal Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. If you want a copy, let me know down below or email me and I'll send you a copy, okay? A PDF or even just a link, maybe depending on what you want. And they fully admit, nearly the first sentence, right? Clothing is ubiquitous, right? It's super important, right? But that there's very little empirical study about it. They specifically says empirical study is relatively sparse. You remember, this is what I said when I did this last video, okay? They talk about how other kinds of aesthetics, and I agree that fashion is an aesthetic. When I think about, say, like myself, and I usually say that I'm not really artistic, and the truth is, you could argue that my style is my artistic expression. One of the challenges in this field, and one of the things that's missing from this paper, is an understanding of how fashion is generated as some internal, as manifested from some internal systems that generate displays in the world. Not just something interesting to study about human culture, right? So they talk about how visual arts, design, literature, music, all these things have quite a bit of literature backing them up, right? So for example, Sam Gosling's work on the Stomps scale, trying to understand types of music people listen to and who are those kinds of people. But the fashion research is limited, all right? And they talk about how there's some, I'll just throw it on the ground. There is some work, of course, in social psychology, and this would have a lot to do with things like perceptions, right? So how do you perceive a person who, for instance, has lots of makeup on, or how do you perceive a person who has a suit? And research in mating psychology, dating psychology, which is social psychology, shows, for example, that when you put women in super fancy clothes or relatively blah clothes, like a Burger King outfit or something like that, a worker, right? Men's desire to date that person is basically invariant. It's completely determined how attractive the woman wearing the clothes is. The clothes have no kind of bearing on it. But in women, it's not that case, right? So a man who's very attractive, but you put him in crappy clothes, he becomes less desirable. More importantly, and more maybe for maybe ugly people like me, you take an ugly guy and you dress him up in literally the vestiges of status, power, success, and women will rate him not as only more desirable, but more attractive, right? These two things are often conflated in research. But desirability is the willingness to, go out with someone. But physical attractiveness, or attractiveness for short, is a different judgment. So you can find many things attractive, but it doesn't mean you desire to date them. And so these two things are used in a very slippery way, but nevertheless, that's what some work, for example, in evolutionary social psychology will have examined. Other work in evolutionary psychology will have focused more on how we display our phenotypes, right? We display our value systems, we display our mating strategies. So some work suggests that if you have a large emblem on your shirt, you're more likely to be interested in casual sex than if you have a small emblem. So imagine this, the polo emblem. The big polo emblem is like this loud shouty thing, right? So as a rule, shoutiness is a good indication of, let's call it a fast life history strategy. And fast life history strategies sometimes manifest in interesting casual sex. They often do. They often manifest in things like narcissism, of course, as well. Of course, there's some work related to hiring practices as well, but would you hire this person depending on their outfit? Various things. But in the end, there has been attempts to examine, for example, formal clothing versus casual clothing. What are people's self-perceptions when you put them in different clothes? How do other people perceive other people, right? So would I be evaluated more attractive or more desirable or more hireable if I wore something like this, a more plain outfit, than if I wear a suit like I might wear tonight when I go out? So they do admit that things like fashion should be a reflection of unconscious internal systems, but they focus mostly on personality traits, and we'll get to the kind of personality traits that they are focusing on here in a minute. There's also work, of course, how outfits have to match with environments, right? Choosing, if you're way overdressed, right? If I show up to the beach in a tuxedo, well, that's, the mismatch is of course a problem. And no surprise, because it's clothing, a lot of this has to do with marketing. Is how can we understand and therefore better market, and let's just be honest, exploit people to buy more clothes, right? So if Facebook works out that I'm interested in fashion, and it does, of course, then it markets stuff to me, right? So by clicking today, for example, I bought 4 ties and a pair of brown suede tassel loafers. So Google and all these things can record that information. So this is expressed, this is my revealed preference. But most research in social psychology, personality psychology, like this paper here, focuses on expressed preferences. And these are tricky to measure, as we'll get at as we go through this paper here, right? And so what this paper does is it's an attempt to reduce and extend a pre-existing scale by the first author. This was a scale published in 2023. And it was focused on UK residents only. And it is heavily reliant on what's called factor analysis. And I won't belabor you or bore you with the statistical problems with this. But ultimately, it's based on the assumption that items that people respond to similarly, that similarity is because of something internal about them, some latent system. This idea of latent systems, latent psychologies comes a lot from Freud, for example, and of course modern personality psychology that tries to capture people's internal dispositions through the examination of multiple correlated indicators, like smaller things that are meant to capture the range of the thing, like extroversion, right? Extroversion is a personality trait, as we call it, but it's a latent thing. It's something inside. So we measure extroversion with a series of items, and we get it this latent, this underlying. Yeah? And so what he was trying to do in the original and trying to do here is understand these latent systems by asking people a series of questions and seeing how their responses correlate with one another, looking at those patterns. But one of the problems is if you start with either poor items, a limited understanding, or you assume naively complexity when you don't need to in the beginning, that you find yourself struggling with complexity prematurely, and it creates a messy story, which is what they've unfortunately created here as I go through it here. The authors here, because originally the scale was a UK sample, so they try to extend it to an American sample. Say, can we look at the same patterns? Do we find the same patterns of correlated fashion indicators, let's call them, in the United States as the UK? Well, this sounds like a kind of okay idea, but let's be honest, those are two rather similar cultures, right? Linguistically, historically, right? Indeed, in Japan, while up until recently, Japanese culture in fashion has really been trying to mimic American culture, like for instance with denim, modern Japanese fashion trends are moving towards some different tendencies. Now, I won't do the Japanese because I'll just do it no justice, but it's things like seeking impermanence, embracing perfection, and having a restrained or understated kind of fashion sense. And so these themes in Japanese fashion, modern Japanese fashion, come back from more traditional ways of dressing from Japan, and they might not very well fit with the framework created in this. And so if we want to understand fashion, and when fashion is a universal thing, we need to find a way to create cross-national, cross-cultural metrics and conceptualizations that I don't think you can really say you have if you look at Americans and the United Kingdom. Do you? I mean, it's hard to see what are the genuine differences between these, and why would you expect there to be difference? So it's kind of this superficial cross-national validation, right? It's like, well, why would you think it would be different? Like, pick a disparate culture, Turkish culture, for example, right? And then maybe you might see some differences, and maybe you can predict what those differences are, but if you haven't worked out a systematic way that is replicable to study these things, it falls apart before you even gotten started, because you can't make predictions about things if you don't even have reliable instruments to do that research, all right? So the data is collected online through a system called Prolific. I have no objections to Prolific. These are probably, however, relatively affluent people as a result. So thankfully it's standardized in the sense that it's affluent people from both countries, right? So that's nice. But it still doesn't really capture the kind of range of fashion that you would get in different kind of subcultural niches, right? And so fast fashion, urban, various kinds of styles that you would see. And these aren't really captured by those two samples, of course, but they're not really captured in the paper either. And so the fixation of the scale that they have here is not my preferred, or the way that I would go about doing this, as we've talked about, okay? One thing I do like that they did is they examined both liking and ownership. I like this, right? So that the patterns of ownership can be affected by how much money you have, for example, right? But what you like, similarly, so I could like lots of things, right? But if I can't afford them, it's a different story, yeah? But people are often very generous in their ratings of liking. So asking people what they own might actually be quite useful, although it turns out those two scales, those two measures are correlated. So it's not all that much of a surprise, because our internal liking system should lead us to buying things, right? Liking is essentially an attitude. As long as we have the behavioral intention and the capability to buy it, we're going to do so. Even if we don't, we might find other ways, right? So I just learned that one of my favorite kinds of pants is sold at a store called Reserved. Reserved is a rather affordable, kind of fast fashion-y brand, and they're very affordable compared to what I'm used to paying. So anyway, so they use some other scales, like something called a fashion orientation questionnaire, 17 items, fashion attitudes, looks at fashion leadership, fashion interests. This is just really, as it says, a fashion attitudinal measure. It doesn't really capture how people use fashion, how, for example, it would describe like what are the kinds of people who would go into the fashion industry. Like, why would you be an influencer? Why would you be a fashion designer? And maybe also your attitudes about the importance. But this, like the other scales here, are derived via these factor analytic methods, and they don't necessarily reflect the entirety of the experience if you don't have enough of the items to capture those other things. And so it's the saying, shit in, shit out. If you don't have good items to go in, what you get out is not all that great. They then include the big five. The big five personality traits, if you don't know, are best remembered with the acronym OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And these are considered broadband personality traits. They measure it with a relatively brief measure, a short form measure. Totally fine with that. But they include it in a very exploratory way. So they're not really making any pointed predictions about the kinds of people that should wear or have certain kinds of fashion systems in their brain. Yeah? And so that's pretty much standard practice. Everything you have here is called classical test theory. And so it's really an exploratory study here more than it is anything else. And it's very hard to see much of the signal here because there isn't really directed testing. So they do a lot of work with factor analysis, but they also use some qualitative research to reduce the number of potential clothing items that they might include. They do some thematic analysis. They're really trying to figure out ways to be systematic about the items that they choose, which I appreciate. But what I would suggest, though, is maybe you've overthought the problem. Maybe it's too complex. So start smaller. Instead of relying on these factor analytic techniques, which personality psychologists obsessively do, maybe just break it down to something more basic, right? Something like we talked about level of formality scale, or choosing different outfits and asking people which would they choose. Importantly, what this study doesn't do is take into account really the contextual factors. So asking someone what outfits they would wear in general is nice, but asking them what outfits they would wear as a function of different events would be even better, because you might find issues with mismatch as a function of, say, personality, right? So narcissists might dress up regardless of the context, potentially, right? And people high in psychopathy might always dress down regardless of the context. People who are neurotic might be more sensitive to these considerations, but what they've done here is really just treated personality in a really exploratory way, as opposed to, I of course would include the dark triad, no surprise there, right? That's my bread and butter. But I think you could make some really straightforward predictions with personality if you just gave it a little bit of time to mull it over a little more, and maybe simplify the way in which you're studying the actual preferences themselves. So a lot of the paper is focused on trying to validate, using this factor analysis stuff, these dimensional systems of these measures. And in each case, you get rather unflattering measures of fit. And so fit is a statistical metric. Don't worry about what it particularly means. It's just that the model doesn't fit the data very well. And because what we have here is a kind of tortured approach to try to understand these latent systems. There is an assumption that, one, there are latent systems, and two, that the items used are good at capturing those latent systems. And indeed, with only, say, 34 items, it might not be all that good. Indeed, when you go to their table 1, you get some messiness, that some of it doesn't really make all that much sense. Like, for example, in their clothing preferences measure, you have factor 2 being called dresses and skirts, but you have items here capturing jumpsuits, play suits, rompers, nightwear, pajamas. These don't fit in the dresses and suits. They are things that people might care to wear, right? So maybe what needs to be done is just take all of these kinds of clothing and treat them as single items. Don't assume that there's latent systems yet. Start with something more simple, like let's just describe, right? So here is 35 kinds of clothing. Here is whatever the number is, yeah? And then describe people's personality from there, right? Don't go to sophisticated stats unless you really, really need to and have really, really good reason to do so. Similarly, in the next grouping called clothing description, the same one, you have, in the same in clothing preferences, you have denim being composed of denim and jeans. So not only is this problematic because there's only 2 items, but it's repetitive. It's essentially the same 2 items, right? Denim and jeans. So these 2 are included, and there's no surprise they create a factor, right? So there is not a really good smattering or cross-section of the kind of items I would like to see in fashion here. They move on to other things like clothing function. I agree. Clothing serves function. These are all assuming that people have kind of underlying latent motivational systems. And so maybe they should just ask people, look, here are the 6 functions that they propose. Forget the items. Just ask people straight out, right? Do you wear clothes for these reasons? Here are the reasons, though, by the way, right? So concealment, right? Concealment is about camouflaging yourself so you become less noticeable. Attraction, right? I want to look great. To self-expression, okay, I like that. 4, social signaling, right? I want to say that I'm competent, I'm successful, great, love it, no problem. Protection and functionality, right? So if you're a construction worker or something like that, maybe you have, or you have pants with big pockets in it for hold things. And then, of course, no surprise, political expression. And so if we assume that these are a good cross-section of the functions, we could skip the items entirely and just ask people, do you wear clothes for which one? Concealment or attraction? Which one more, for example, right? Or just single items on a scale of 1 to 5. We are so reliant on these factor analytic methods that we're almost blind to some of this simplicity, because we are taught in stats classes, which of course I have taught people, that we are distrusting of single item measures. Now, I agree with that in principle, but if we don't have good reason for complexity, we should simplify, simplify, simplify. It's not until we have a better grasp of these things, and I think what they're doing here is kind of backwards. They're assuming complexity. They're using a statistical technique to measure, to say, look how complex this is, and then they're trying to justify that complexity over and over. They assume that the factor analytic system works, but we know from factor analytical studies that oftentimes these don't replicate from study to study. This is one of the problems. So start with simple. And I think it would be much more interesting if they did just that here, right? They don't seem to consider any sort of moderation by men and women in this paper, right? Or even in this factor structure, that men and women might think of, they might have different factorial structures. But if we have some examination of sex differences, and they kind of have done this, the problem is they have done really complex analysis throughout the study. They almost didn't do anything basic, like zero-order correlations, or t-tests, or ANOVAs. Instead, they just did path analyses. And path analyses are some of these pictures that you can see, like here, right? Which they look kind of pretty sometimes, but I think they're very problematic for various reasons. And one of the reasons here is that they have assumed that demographic factors, personality factors, education, and sex are antecedent conditions. Now, I agree that they're antecedent in the sense that they're likely to predict other things about people, but I think they'd be more interesting to look at as, say, moderators, right? So it may be that the correlation between extroversion and some fashion preference might be different in men and women. And so what it has here in this paper is just this long list of what are called beta weights. Don't worry about the statistics, but beta weights are particularly hard to interpret. So instead of just reporting for us basic correlations, which would allow us to see how personality traits genuinely just simply relate to these different fashion dimensions, we have to control for all these other things simultaneously. So it's like asking you, what is the correlation between extroversion and something when you remove age and sex differences and other demographic factors, as well as other personality traits? It's very hard to make sense of. And so again, they are, I think, jumping the gun into complexity when it's not necessary. Okay, let me move on. So some of the things they find, of course, things like attraction function was positively predicted by fashion interest and extroversion. This is kind of this really terrible way that academics write. They could just say people who were more interested in, who people thought that attraction was an important function, also were interested in fashion, or something like straightforward. But instead, what people often do as researchers, they focus on the predictors and not the people. They focus on the constructs and not what we're trying to actually learn about, which is people. And so I think a lot of what's going on in this study is a rather naive approach to fashion research. And I'm not trying to say naive in an insulting way. I mean, they're saying, look, we don't know a lot about fashion. And so let's use these statistical methods, what is essentially a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, to try to understand, well, what's going on here? Let's try to paint the picture. I have done this many times, but I think that it's actually premature in this case, and it's actually making the story harder to understand than is necessary. So I think the best way to go about studying fashion would be to try to understand in the world. So start basic, right? So what is it that people wear, right? Let's just take kind of outfits. There's different looks: sporty, urban, casual. Like, we can come up with these labels, right? We could even present pictures to people, right? So one study by Christina Durante had women draw on a body, a shape of a body, the kind of dress a woman would want to wear when she would go out that night. Now, she was doing an ovulation study, but we could do something similar as that. We could have people build outfits, right? What is the kind of thing you would like to wear to a job interview? What is the kind of thing you'd like to wear to a first date? And we could correlate that with personality. We could look at sex differences in that. We could look at country level differences in that. We just have to get a good grasp of the larger space of fashion. And again, it's going to be challenging because different cultures have different traditional views but we should be able to understand, because culture doesn't come out of the air, right? It's not installed upon us. It is a naturally occurring phenomenon. So why might people from one part of the world dress in a particular way versus others? What are the historical reasons, but what are also the ecological reasons, for example, for choosing particular kinds of clothing? So the black gowns of the Bedouin would appear to be a really silly thing to wear in the desert, but it turns out the black, not only the black and the nature of the fabric creates like an internal air conditioning system to keep people cool. And so we cannot just look at fashion through the Western lens, right? This is the point about the UK and the US, right? The Japanese style has its own idiosyncrasies that are developing as greater individuality and greater cultural expression comes out. But still, there should be universal patterns in how people dress, or the reasons why they dress the way they dress. So, nevertheless, I'm very happy that people are doing this research. I hope to get into this myself at some point soon. I hope this was relatively informative to you, and no hate to these authors. This is something that's really hard to do, as I've already talked about. It's very hard to figure out where to start, and so they've given an attempt at starting, and I just would choose a different way of starting it. So that's all for me. Please like, share, comment, and maybe we'll do some more fashion another time. Okay? Ciao.